Hello. Chris Spargo recently made a video titled, "I just want to show you some weird stones." That caught my attention because the first stone featured there was this, the Stone of Free Speech. It's a stone I know well. I often come to Hampstead Heath for walks, and I frequently walk past it and even a few times have sat at the base of it, wondering about its origins. Chris didn't have much to say about the history or the original purpose of this stone, and I got the sense for a change he wanted to make a video where he didn't first have to do weeks of planning and preparation and research. Having myself spent pretty much every waking hour so far this month researching the history of various types of source, it's a sentiment I can sympathise with. But that left the way open for a far more obscure YouTuber like myself to dig into the history and possibly even meaning of this enigmatic lump of rock. This is going to be a case of putting together what scraps can be found, as there is no definitive information on the Stone of Free Speech today. Not on the web, at least. It doesn't even have a Wikipedia page. It does have a photo on the Wikimedia website, which I think in turn came from the Geograph website. And there is a bit of blurb attached to that that suggests it's possibly 200 years old, but it doesn't cite any sources to substantiate that claim. Some of these stones in London are listed by Historic England. For example, the Wealdstone, which also featured in Chris's video, and coincidentally, I also made a video about from a slightly more pubby angle over on Tweedy Pubs. Parish boundary stones are often also listed here in London. One example I can think of is the one near the Seven Stars on Carey Street in Holborn. In a similar vein, old milestones, I recently made a video about the Wealdstone up at the top end of Hampstead Heath. That is also listed. The Stone of Free Speech, however, is not listed. Perhaps we can start by describing the stone as we find it today. It stands in a grassy field on the slopes of Parliament Hill. The summit of Parliament Hill rises to 98 metres above sea level and has famous views out over London. The Stone of Free Speech is partway up the hill, I think at an altitude of about 70 metres. It's about 2 metres tall. Chris Spargo pointed out it's slightly taller than him. I think it's slightly taller than me too. I think it's made of some kind of limestone. The Wealdstone to the north of Hampstead Heath and that parish boundary stone down in Holborn were both made of Portland stone, which seems to have been a common stone for this kind of thing over the last few centuries. This stone looks a little bit paler to me than Portland stone, but if any geologists are watching, I'd be really keen to hear your thoughts. It's square at the base, then about 2/3 of the way up it switches to being octagonal. Around that octagonal section there are perhaps 4 grooves in the stone, and then finally at the tip it's pointed, a sort of pyramid shape. There's an Ordnance Survey benchmark on one side, as pointed out in Chris's video as well, and we'll come back to that a bit later. Some sources suggest there was an inscription on one side of the stone at one time. It's not visible today. Cheers. On to the name then, the Stone of Free Speech. I wonder if this is a name it has acquired in relatively recent history, as I couldn't find any written reference to it prior to the 1970s. The earliest newspaper mention is in 1972, and that's an announcement that the local druids would be making a procession to the Stone of Free Speech for the autumn equinox. There are similar mentions throughout the 1970s, including this one from 1977 in an article titled "Druid Time." That follows with, "If druids are your whim, you can join in a special celebration ceremony for spring equinox at the Stone of Free Speech, Parliament Hill Fields." A Stone of Free Speech in one corner of Hampstead Heath is obviously reminiscent of the notion of Speaker's Corner, something more commonly associated today with another London park, Hyde Park. However, traditionally, many of these green spaces in London would have had a designated area for people to get upon their soapbox and air their opinions. Lincoln's Inn Fields is one example of that, and this 1964 article has one particular soapbox orator, Henry Tompkins, express his preference for the Fields over Speaker's Corner, because he found that the standard of questioning was higher there. An article in 1966 alludes to the similar reputation that Parliament Hill had around that time. Prior to that, records of public meetings on Parliament Hill pop up here and there, but none mention the stone directly. For example, a meeting relating to the piano trade dispute of 1920 makes one wonder who the keynote speaker was there. Sorry. more industrial action to the backdrop of the general strike in 1926. And the author of the article writes, "Remarks were far less reportable when we ran into a strikers' demonstration at Camden Town, which was marching back from meeting on Parliament Hill." And it wasn't all strikes and trade unions. It seems Parliament Hill was used for public meetings by all parts of the political spectrum. In 1936, former MP John Beckett was fined 40 shillings for insulting behaviour at a meeting of fascists here at Parliament Hill. Perhaps the stone was the rallying point for all of those meetings, and its purpose was just commonly known. There was no need to explicitly state it. Or perhaps it had a different name prior to the 1970s. One thing we can actually be reasonably sure about is that it was here throughout the 20th century. And we know that thanks to some old maps. This is in fact the oldest record I was able to find for the stone's existence. It's on the 1890s Ordnance Survey map. It's marked at that time simply as pillar, but it is in precisely the location where it stands today. And we have some further evidence that it's referring to the same thing because the benchmark is recorded at that time. BM 233.45, whatever that means. There are earlier OS maps covering the area, but that one from the 1890s seems to be the earliest where the stone is marked. If we go back to the OS map of around 1870, for example, the stone doesn't seem to be marked at that time, at least not in its current location. Now, that's not definitive proof that the stone was not there at that time. There is a stone marked a little further down the hill on the junction with the path that leads up from the Lido, but that could well be unrelated. That circa 1870 Ordnance Survey map does, however, record some other benchmarks nearby, so I think we can at least be sure that the benchmark we now see on the stone wasn't there at that time. That could relate to the fact that Parliament Hill and Hampstead Heath were still privately owned at that point in history. That map has plenty of benchmarks on the surrounding public roads, but as far as I can tell, none in any of the green space of Hampstead Heath. Comparing those two maps side by side, the one from around 1870 and the one from the mid-1890s, it does look like some of the paths were laid out in the interim and other improvements made to the surrounding area, including, for example, that toilet block being built at that time. Still there today, although I don't think it's that original building. These changes probably coincided with Hampstead Heath and Parliament Hill coming into public ownership in the 1870s and 1880s. That was supported by the Hampstead Heath Act of 1871 and the related Hampstead Heath Enlargement Act of 1886. I believe it was originally the Metropolitan Board of Works who had custodianship, and that eventually passed down to the City of London Corporation, who run the Heath today. So it is possible that the stone was first installed as part of those improvements when the Heath came into public ownership. And perhaps it was an amenity put there for the people in the 1870s or 1880s to designate this corner of the park as Hampstead Heath's equivalent of Hyde Park's Speaker's Corner. So that's all I was able to find out about the Stone of Free Speech. In the absence of any other evidence, I think it's most likely it was put here around 150 years ago, probably by the Metropolitan Board of Works. And if that is the case, then in a way it's a monument to the public ownership of Hampstead Heath and Parliament Hill. A space which is now free for all to enjoy, and as part of that, one corner where people could come and speak freely. If anyone out there has any more information about it, I'd be really interested to hear. Thanks for watching.